I'm hereby launching my podcast On Emergence. So why have I chosen to call this show On Emergence? And what will I be exploring here? You know that moment you're sitting in a strategy meeting, a policy discussion, or a leadership offsite, and the conversation is developing quickly, being guided by the most tenacious voices towards a conclusion, but something in you notices that the answer being reached is not wrong exactly, but one layer too shallow. The real leverage point is somewhere underneath what's being discussed, and the room is about to move on without finding it. This is a pattern I've observed across organizations, policy tables, industries, and entrepreneurial teams. The people in these rooms are driven, they're motivated, they want to create impact, and we're not here to assign fault at all. But the issue is that we've all been trained to find the most legible answer, the clearest narrative, and the one that can succinctly be written onto one slide. What we weren't always trained to do is look at what's happening between the elements, at what only becomes visible once the system is alive and moving. Issues are intrinsically interlinked, and we need an approach that's meticulous and complexity embracing enough that it almost feels scientific in how it lays out the network effects. We need to dig deeper to get to the true issue. We can't resign ourselves to the first most obvious answer, especially when we're dealing with wicked problems. This gap between the answer that's visible and the dynamic that's really driving outcomes is what we call emergence. Emergence defines the properties of a system that are only visible when they're functioning together. There are certain characteristics that we can't learn by looking at each element on its own. Essentially, the concept of emergence is our proof that analysis is not sufficient on its own. Because you can understand every element of a team, market, or ecosystem individually and still completely miss what happens when they meet. I first encountered this concept not in a business book, but across my studies of sustainable innovation, policy, quantum physics, environmental chemistry, and so many other fields. This insight didn't come from one field. It arose from my understanding of many, so it is fittingly an emergent property itself. Reading Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems really crystallized this concept for me. It motivated me towards a year of active exploration of systems thinking and fundamentally shifted how I see organizations, leadership, and strategic decision making. Though this moment was now 10 years ago, I remember it vividly because it was like receiving a new pair of glasses and realizing I'd been navigating a blurry world thinking it was clear. So the characteristics that emerge in the interaction of elements is the thread that runs through everything I'll be exploring in this podcast, and is the reason I've named it On Emergence. We realize through this careful examination what becomes possible when we look at the systems we're managing more closely, when we resist the first most legible answer and go a level deeper. We can all strengthen our strategic leadership decisions this way, together. Because I know that most of the ambitious leaders I've met aren't lacking in intelligence or motivation. What's missing when we encounter frictions is the space and the framework to examine finer points. The nuance of how the elements of an organization interact, whether those elements are processes, people, incentives, or culture. In a head-first storming into impact, influence, or responsibility, these details can get left behind. I've often felt I could only steer an ongoing discussion one small step toward the maximally impactful point. So I'm creating this space, this podcast, to explore the maximum impact points I've identified through years of experience. What we'll explore together here is how complexity can become a competitive advantage, not a burden. How organizational design can either enable or suppress emergence. Why the personal and the professional are not separate systems to be compartmentalized, and their interaction is fundamental to sustainable success. How the economy is being rebuilt by leaders who learned to see what the old accounting system didn't measure. How we integrate what's been falsely separated. Logic and intuition, structure and flow, the rigorous and the creative. These aren't abstract ideas, they have direct consequences for how we lead, how we build, and what we're able to create. This show is for corporate and entrepreneurial leaders, for aspiring and established leaders, the leaders I've studied alongside, met at conferences, worked next to in co-working spaces, and connected with across my sustainable innovation work. People who are already operating at a high level and who I believe can go further, not by working harder, but by seeing more completely. We're not here to slow down, we're here to look more carefully together. Every episode will bring a concept, a case, a thinker, a tension, and sometimes a guest who's lived an experience worth learning from. Always with a question worth carrying into your week. On Emergence is where radical thinking meets possibility. I'm so glad you're here, and let's dive deeper in the first episode.